I'm joined today by Todd Ziebarth, who is from the. Sorry, let me start again.
Okay.
I looked away. I looked down at my notes unnecessarily. Okay. I'm joined today by Todd Ziebarth from the National Alliance of Public Charter Schools. Todd, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Here in Mississippi, we are about to celebrate 10 years of charter schools, 10 years since the legislation that allows charter schools to come into effect. Tell us, why have charter schools been such a force for good across America? What is it they do that other public schools don't do as well?
Yes, I think one of the unique things about charter schools is they have the flexibility to innovate, to try new and different things. At the same time, in exchange for that, there's a level of accountability in the school to the parents and the broader community. So I think that helps focus people in the school around what's best for the kids in that school. They have, the freedom to innovate, to try new things, balanced out with that accountability. And it's proven particularly good for low-income kids of color in districts all across the country, where we see reading and math results for those kids far exceed what the students in the district schools are achieving.
I mean, charter schools, as you know and I know, have been a great success. We've had 10 years in which they've been allowed under Mississippi law. And yet I can't help noticing a rather uncomfortable fact. There are still only 8 in the entire state of Mississippi. Why is this? Why? First of all, why are some people opposed to charter schools?
Yeah, I think some people are opposed to charter schools because they're ignorant about them. They haven't been in charter schools. They haven't seen the great things that charter school teachers are doing with their students. I think a lot of it is rooted in that ignorance about charter schools. But in some other cases, I think you have people who are kind of wedded to the existing system, the status quo, and don't want to deviate at all from that status quo, and don't want to support anything other than the district system.
I visited some charter schools here in Mississippi, and the enthusiasm is infectious. You quite often have a principal who maybe set the school up out of a real belief in the vision of charter schools. And often that individual who was played a lead role in setting up the school, that enthusiasm becomes kind of the cultural norm across the school, and there's a real joy in being there. In fact, the charter schools in Mississippi are oversubscribed. There are more people wanting to go than there are places available, and I'm not sure I've picked up that vibe in some of the non-charter schools.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I mean, the cultural aspect of what parents, staff, and students are able to create together in these innovative public schools is something that you can just pick up right when you kind of enter the building. And I've been in charter schools all across the country, and that is often a common denominator you feel when you enter one of these schools or one of these classrooms. And again, I think that has a lot to do with the freedom and flexibility that school founding groups have when they're setting up these schools to create that sense of focus in the culture and to rally people around it. I think it creates a real sense of enthusiasm. People are choosing to be there. Staff are choosing to be there. Parents are choosing to be there, as opposed to being assigned to a school either as a teacher or a parent that you're really not enthusiastic about or committed to.
Now, 10 years ago, when organizations like yours and mine were working on legislation for Mississippi to allow us to set up charter schools, it seemed kind of sensible to have an authorizer board. The idea was that someone wanted to set up a school, they would have to apply to the authorizer board, who would kind of make sure that they had a business plan that stacked up, to make sure that the math added up, and just basic kind of quality control. But it pains me to say, a decade later, it looks as if that authorizer board is in effect a roadblock to reform. They've got a record of rejecting 8 out of 10 applications. Why is that? Is it purely a lack of quality applications, or is there an agenda?
Right. I don't think it's a lack of quality applications. I don't think it's an agenda either. I think there just appears to be a very high degree of risk aversion among either the staff or the board members with the charter board. And I agree. I think we've been very disappointed. On the one hand, we've been very encouraged and excited by all of the letters of intent, by all of the applications through communities all across Mississippi that have been filed over the last 10 years, but very discouraged by, I think, the lack of support to make sure those groups write strong applications, and then the lack of risk taking, for lack of a better phrase, by the authorizing board. I mean, an application does not have to be perfect in order to get approved, and that seems, unfortunately, to be the standard with the board there. It's got us sort of concerned that some of our best charter schools across the country in their early days probably would not have been able to get approved by this board, which is very concerning. So I think you want to be responsible as an authorizer. You want to make sure people have a high probability to succeed, but you can't expect for perfection, and you can't be so risk averse that after 10 years you only have 8 schools that are open.
How have other states dealt with this problem? Because I can't believe that we're the only state that's had this problem. What are some of the solutions in terms of changing the authorizer process that we might look at?
Yeah, I think, Mississippi is unique in that there's only one authorizing entity. Most states allow multiple authorizers. Sometimes that means you could go to your local school district, or you could go to a entity like the State Charter Board of Mississippi. In other states, you maybe could go to a public university, University of Mississippi, Mississippi State, some other public university to be authorized. Even in some states, they allow cities, city councils or mayors to be authorized. So there's all kinds of options. And I think what we've recommended to states is, you want to have multiple avenues. You don't want to have too many, because what you find with too many is you sort of see quality become diluted. You want to have that balance where people have, with a good application, have an opportunity to get a fair hearing and to get approved. But at the same time, you don't want so many authorizers where quality is really being diluted. And right now, Mississippi, one authorizing pathway, given the, you probably want to consider changing the board members with new appointments for that board at some point. But in parallel with that, creating another authorizing pathway, maybe through a public university there.
Could you get a statewide official, I don't know, say, for example, the Secretary of State or the Lieutenant Governor to be an authorizer?
We haven't seen that yet. What we've seen, probably the closest we've seen to that, is we worked last year in Wyoming with the legislature there to change their law, and they allowed what they call the State Loan and Investment Board to be an authorizer. They didn't want to create a new entity, so they gave it to an existing authority, and that has the governor, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Education, the treasurer, those kinds of statewide elected officials on there. It's an existing board already. So I don't think Mississippi has something like that, but we haven't seen like an individual like the Secretary of State, Lieutenant Governor become the authorizer in a state yet.
I simply wondered because I sometimes wonder maybe if in a state like Mississippi it needs an individual to really champion it. And, I'm with Wyoming. Don't create new institutions and individuals when you can get an existing one. And also there would be a certain sort of vested interest, if you like, if you're running for statewide office, if you could say, vote for me as Lieutenant Governor or State Auditor or State Secretary of State, and I will become the champion of more charter schools. I can see a lot of parents, grandparents responding very positively to that.
Right. Yes. Yeah. And I think, I'd have to go back and look at how the board there is appointed, but often when we have boards like the one in Mississippi, you do have either the governor or you have a few different, elected officials making the appointments to the board of those, but it's not a direct, they're not the authorizers directly.
Here's another thought. Rather than having an authorizing process where every time you want to open a new charter school, you have to go through the process, could you change the authorizing process so that you are in effect being a licensed provider? And once you as an organization have been approved to be a licensed provider, hey, you can go ahead and and run as many charter schools as you can set up. A little bit like for example, dentistry. You don't need to go and get permission from a state board every time you want to give someone some fillings and dentures, but you do need to be licensed to be a dentist.
Yeah, I think, we haven't seen any states do that. What we have seen are some states try to make it easier for existing operators who are running high quality schools, however that state defines it, to not have to go through the same process that a brand new school would have to go through. Schools that have a long established track record of, good financial, good academic performance, high re-enrollment rates among students, clearly, not only good for the students, but good for taxpayers, saying to those schools, you don't have to go through the same process. You have an accelerated process, or one that's not as burdensome, but we still think there needs to be some kind of check and balance, even though it might not be as extensive on you opening up a new school. And that's something we think that kind of strikes a good balance between the licensing approach and making somebody who's been running great schools have to go through a very burdensome process to open a new one.
One other slight complaint that I feel people have about charter schools is they often associate a charter school with failure. Under the Mississippi law, you can theoretically open a charter school in any school board district, whether you're rated A or F, but you need the permission of the local school board district unless you're in a failing district. And what that in effect means is that you're not going to get permission unless you're in a failing neighborhood. And so we tend to see the handful of charter schools we have in districts where things are bad. And I rather fear that means that charter schools are kind of labeled as something you do when things are failing, rather than being actually the potential great success story that I think they should be. What should we do to try to make sure that there's a charter school available in every district, whether it's doing really well or not doing so well?
Remove that provision of law. We would say that's one of the highest priorities for Mississippi policymakers when they tackle revising the charter school law, whether it's next session or the session after. It's figure out how to create a new authorizing pathway and remove this requirement that if you want to start a charter in A, B, or C district, you have to get the district to sign off on it, because we knew this at the time. It was a political compromise that was made, but if you have that provision in there, guess what? You're not going to get any charter schools in those districts. Not a big surprise. We think parents in all communities want options, need options, and we see that in states all across the country where you have charter schools open in urban areas, in small towns, in suburban areas, all types of communities. And my sense is if you remove that provision from Mississippi's law, you'll begin to see charter schools want to open in A communities, B communities, C communities, in addition to the communities they're opening in right now. And we think that's good for families and it's good for the state.
That's certainly one of our priorities. I mean, we've got a number of bills in this session, and if we don't succeed in this session, we'll be preparing the ground this session for next session. But we are very keen on changing that requirement. We're very keen on multiple authorizer boards or entities. And we're also really keen on this idea that if you are an approved operator of charter schools, you shouldn't have to go through the same high regulatory hurdle every time. And I think, fundamentally, if we want to change Mississippi, which is often ranked 50th out of 50 states, if we want to change Mississippi for the better, you can't ignore the fundamental issue of suboptimal outcomes in public education. And yes, you can improve things by spending more money, and you can improve things by doing all kinds of change. But I think charter schools are absolutely essential, key part of the reforms that are needed. So
absolutely, yeah.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time. Any other final thoughts you want to say as we celebrate 10 years of charter schools in Mississippi?
Well, I would just say, it's easy to be discouraged that there are only 8 schools, but I tend to sort of look at all of the pent-up interest and demand that we know is there. And I think it's about making these changes to the environment there to really let that pent-up demand loose, not only in quote unquote failing districts, but in districts all across the state. So we really encourage Mississippi policymakers to make the kinds of changes you're pushing to the law there to really create a vibrant charter school sector there.
Fantastic, Todd. Thank you so much for your time. And if there are things you think we, Mississippi Center for Public Policy, can do to help, please don't hesitate to reach out. We need as many organizations in this coalition we're building here in Mississippi as we can. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you.